All right, today I'd like to take you through the PowerPoint slides for the next section in the microeconomics portion of this course that talks about government intervention in markets. So what we'll go over for you today is an introduction to what types of interventions are possible, and these are just very basic categories. Those are price ceilings, price floors, and taxes, and we'll talk about how you use supply and demand analysis in order to predict the effects of those government interventions. Okay, so one type of intervention that a government can put on is a price ceiling. A price ceiling is a maximum price by law that the government imposes so that you may not legally purchase or sell anything at a price above that ceiling, at least not legally. So you find this a lot in developing countries, especially on prices in key sectors like electricity, gasoline, certain types of foods, and medicine. So here's, if you look at the slide, there's a list of cities that have rent control. Rent control is just another name for a price ceiling. It means that in these cities in California, you cannot legally charge more than the set statutory level of rent in California. Of course, the idea is, well, you know, California is expensive and people can't afford to pay it, so let's just slap a maximum price on. Well, that sounds really good, right? Nobody likes to pay high prices, so we think maybe economists might like this kind of price ceiling thing. Well, not so much. What happens is that when the government imposes a maximum price or a price ceiling, then essentially they're distorting prices. So if you remember at the very beginning of the semester, we talked about the role of prices. And one of the roles that prices play in a market system is that they are rationing mechanisms. So once you lock down the price, then you prevent the market from doing its job, which is to ration goods and services between competing wants. So if you lock down the price and you don't let it move when it needs to move, then you're going to end up with a shortage. So what will happen then is that since prices can't do their job and say who of the many people who want this product should get it, then generally the market participants will turn to something called a non-price rationing mechanism. For example, you might say, well, there's a line of people and there's 100 available and 300 people want it. We'll just take the first 100 people in the line. You could have to have a coupon to get that. Central planning might decide who gets what. This is very costly and a waste of resources and can really end up with some kind of nasty outcomes. For example, if prices, people who are willing to pay a higher price don't get access to it, then firms may say, well, I'm only going to give the product to people that I know or people who are friends of mine and so on. And you can end up with some really distorted outcomes. So let me give you another example. We talked about rent control, but here's another example. And this is the state of Hawaii. So this is a quote from 2005. The state's Public Utilities Commission said that wholesalers may not charge more than 2.1578, including federal, state, and county fuel taxes in Honolulu for a gallon of unleaded, and separate price caps for other islands. So it's a price ceiling. You can't sell gas for more than $2.67 in Honolulu in 2005. Well, let's think about what the effect would this be. Well, this is a nice low price for gas, right? So lots of people are going to want to fill up their tanks, but what do you get? Well, first consider, what if the market price is at the ceiling or less than the ceiling? So suppose that the market price of gas is $2. Well, then a price ceiling of 2.67 wouldn't make any difference, right? Because the price was already at the level it needed to be, and there was no reason for it to go up. But as you see from this picture, that was not the case in Hawaii. The market price is higher than the price ceiling of 2.67. And what happens is lots of people want to buy cheap gas, But think about suppliers. How does gasoline get to Hawaii? Well, it gets shipped in big tankers, right? Why would you want to ship a lot of gasoline to Hawaii for 2.67 a gallon when you can sell it in California for probably a lot more than that? So suppliers don't want to supply very much, but demanders want to buy a lot because it's cheap. So quantity demanded at the price ceiling exceeds the quantity supply, and you end up with a situation like this picture. You end up with great big long lines and pumps that are closed and say, no more gas for today. So here's a picture using supply and demand. So notice that I'm calling this a binding price ceiling. A binding price ceiling is one that is below the equilibrium price. So here you see that the equilibrium price for this product is $2, the intersection of demand and supply, and at that price 40 units will be supplied and 40 units will be demanded, so the market is in balance. But if the price ceiling is below $2, then we have a different situation. So if the price is at $1, suppliers will only want to supply 20 units to the market, whereas demanders would like to buy 60 at a price of $1. So you end up with a shortage of 40 units, that horizontal distance there. The quantity demanded is much larger than the quantity supplied, so 40 people who would like to pay $1 for this product will not be able to do so, and you end up with the shortage. So normally in a market, the price would be bid up, right? Because those 40 people who can't get the product would be willing to say to suppliers, well, I'll give you $1.50, I'll give you $1.75. But remember, that's illegal now. You can't do that, at least not outside of black markets. So the moral of the story is let the invisible hand of the market do its job. So that picture right there is Adam Smith. Adam Smith, who wrote The Wealth of Nations in 1776, is the father of this concept of the invisible hand of the market. So if you interfere with the market mechanism, if you try to set prices in another way, it can have some very, very nasty effects. Okay, now we're going to turn our hand to another way the government can interfere in the market, and this is with a price floor or a minimum price. This is when the government, instead of saying you can't sell it at a price above this, the government would say, well, you can't sell this at a price below this price legally. So, for example, the minimum wage in the U.S. Is a minimum price of labor. There are also minimum prices for milk and wheat in some European countries. This type of price support is usually some form of an income support for farmers or other agricultural producers. A price floor can be binding or non-binding, just as a price ceiling can be binding or non-binding. Remember, binding means that it has an effect. So in the case of price ceilings, if the price ceiling was above the equilibrium price, it didn't have an effect. It only had an effect if it was below. Similarly, if you have a price floor that is below the equilibrium price, it's not a problem. It's non-binding. But if it's above the equilibrium price, then you have trouble and you're going to end up with surpluses. So here's a picture of a binding price floor. So our equilibrium price, as before, is $2, and at that price 40 units are supplied, 40 units are demanded. If the government comes along and says, well, really there needs to be a higher price for that because producers aren't getting enough income, then they raise the price floor to $4. $4, only 15 people want to buy, or 15 units are demanded. But at that nice high price, sellers would like to sell 65. So you get a shortage of 65 minus 15, or 50 units, that horizontal distance of the green arrow right there, and you end up with a surplus. A lot of stuff that nobody wants to buy that's produced and is sitting around. So once again, price floors are not efficient because they promote overproduction at relatively high costs. So in the case of the European Common Agricultural Policy, or CAP, back in the 90s, that was a series of minimum prices for milk, butter, cheese, and so on. And you ended up with, the government ended up with what they called butter mountains and wine lakes, because there was so much produced that nobody wanted to buy. So the government ended up purchasing it. So again, the moral of the story is that if you have price ceilings, maximum prices, and price floors, minimum prices, they introduce distortions in the market and cause a waste of resources or inefficiencies. So once again, it's preventing prices from performing their function as a rationing mechanism. Okay, so here's an example with minimum wage. So let's take a look at the diagram. The blue downward sloping demand curve is labor demand. Who demands labor? Well, employers do, right? Firms will demand labor. It's downward sloping because if wages are very, very high, then they don't want to hire very many people. And if wages are low, they can hire a lot more people. So at the red upward sloping labor supply, that's you and I. We are households and we supply labor to the market. When wages are very, very low, a lot of people will choose to, for example, stay home, right, and not work. But as wages become higher and higher, it becomes more economically advantageous to participate in the market. Okay, so the equilibrium wage, WE, right, is the intersection of the blue and the red curves. So let's suppose that is intersecting at 40 hours per week, okay? So the government comes in and says, well, in this labor market, I think that WE is too low, so I'm going to slap a minimum wage or a price floor that is binding. That is, it's above the equilibrium wage, WE. Well, what happens? Well, this point, right, this is how much labor is going to be demanded by firms. This much will be supplied by firms. This horizontal distance, right, is the amount of people who would like to work at the minimum wage, but who cannot find positions. So, in other words, we have a surplus of labor, which we call unemployment. So notice that the effect is less pronounced when the labor supply is less elastic or steeper because fewer workers are drawn into the markets by the higher wage. So there's a connection with elasticity. All right. So that's price ceilings and price floors, and if they are binding, then they introduce inefficiencies into the market. Another way that governments can interfere in markets is with taxes. So they're a little different than price controls because they don't immediately paralyze the markets. So once you hit that price ceiling, the market can't do anything. What they do is they essentially influence the markets and slow down the markets. So the questions that we want to answer is, what's the effect of a sales tax on the equilibrium prices and quantities, and then who actually pays the tax? Well, 2 might seem a little bit of a silly question, but it's more complicated than it would seem to be at face value. Okay, first of all, the kind of tax that I'm talking about is referred to as a specific tax. A specific tax. That's a tax of so many dollars or so many cents per unit sold. So, for example, in Indiana, let's suppose that there is a tax on gasoline, and that tax on gasoline is 72 cents per gallon of gasoline. That's the case of a specific tax. There's another kind of tax called an ad valorem or by value tax, and that's a percentage tax. So, for example, sales taxes are percentage tax. That's 7% of the amount that you spend. Okay, so let's suppose for the sake of argument that the tax is assessed on the purchasers of the product. So that is, if you buy, I don't know, let's say you buy coal in Indiana for your coal stove, and let's suppose the tax is 10 cents per pound on coal, and the buyer of the coal actually has to pay the tax to the government, write the check to the government. Okay, so how do we model this? Well, here's the initial demand curve. So the initial demand curve is essentially represents the value to the buyer of a certain number of units. Okay? So you can think of the demand curve as sort of a willingness to pay curve. So, for example, at my original equilibrium, okay, it's $1 and 100 units are being sold. Okay. However, if in fact the buyer has to pay a tax, then their willingness to pay the seller is lower than it would be otherwise. So take, for example, right here. So at this point, for the 70th unit, right, buyers are willing to pay $1.80 altogether. Okay? Well, let's suppose that the government puts $1 tax on it. Well, the buyers are still only willing to pay a total of $1.80. Now they have to pay it to two parties, though. They have to pay $1 to the government, to the government in the form of the tax, and then that leaves only 80 cents as their willingness to pay the seller of this item. So essentially, that $1 tax shifts the demand curve down by the amount of the tax because it reflects a lower willingness to pay. So in the example here, here's the new equilibrium after the tax is imposed. Notice that the market has shrunk. Previously it was 100 units being sold, now it's 70 units being sold. So what is this 80 cents? This 80 cents is what the seller gets now. They used to, before the tax, they got $1, right? But now they're only going to get 80 cents for this. What does the buyer pay? Well, they pay 80 cents to the seller, but additionally they have to pay another $1 to the government, so the total payment for the buyer is $1.80. Okay? So the amount that the seller receives went from $1 to 80 cents, and the amount that the buyer has to pay went from $1 to a total of $1.80. Okay? So the seller is paying 20% of the tax, right, because they're losing 20 cents, and the buyer is paying 80% of the tax because they're paying an additional 80 cents. Okay, so now I'm going to suppose that the government says that the tax has to be paid by the seller. So this is the same market, and it's the same tax of $1, but instead of the buyer having to write a check to the Department of Revenue, the seller has to write the check to the Department of Revenue. Okay, so we're going to model this a little bit differently. So take a look. I've got a supply curve shift. So the supply curve is really a minimum willingness to accept curve, right? So let's take a look at the initial equilibrium. The initial equilibrium is the same as it was before. It's $1, right? And 100 units are sold. But now we're going to put a tax of $1 on this product, and we're going to suppose that the seller has to write the check. So let's take a look at this point here. So at this point here, right, to supply 70 units, right, to the market, the seller needs to get at least 80 cents a unit from the buyer. Correct? At least 80 cents a unit from the buyer. Well, if they charge 80 cents a unit and they have to pay $1 of tax, that's not going to work, is it? So what has to happen? In order to net 80 cents, right, from the buyer, the supplier has to charge $1 more than that, way up here at $1.80, because they then have to pay the tax of $1, so they will get only 80 cents. Okay? So that's true for every point along the supply curve. Now, in order to get the original supply price, they have to charge $1 more. So the supply curve shifts up by $1, right? And what happens? The market shrinks by 30 units, and the price goes up to $1.80. Okay, so what is $1.80? $1.80 is what the consumer pays to the seller. The seller then pays $1 to the government, right, this distance, leaving the seller 80 cents. So, who pays the tax? 80% of it is paid by the consumer because the price they pay went from $1 to $1.80. The seller, the price they received went from $1 to 80 cents. So it went down by 20 cents, so they pay 20% of the tax. So, here's the big picture, right? In both cases, we saw that when you put $1 tax on this market, it doesn't matter who writes the check. It doesn't matter whether the supplier has to physically pay the tax or the demander has to physically pay the tax. You got the same exact result, which is very surprising. Additionally, normally you can often hear people say, oh, if the government puts a tax of $1 something, the price will go up by $1. Is that true? Well, the answer is no, right? So you put $1 tax on and the price went up by 80 cents. So the full incidence of the tax didn't totally fall on the consumer. 80 cents fell on the consumer and 20 cents fell on the supplier in the form of a lower supply price. So depending on the relative elasticities of these curves, both the consumer and the producer both pay the tax. Okay, so let's take a more elastic demand curve. Okay, a more elastic demand curve. So this flatter sort of purple curve is a more elastic demand curve. What will happen if we put that same tax on? Okay, well, we know what happens with the blue curves, right? It goes 100 to 70. But what happens here? This distance is $1, right? This distance is $1. So now we have to find the same distance, this equal distance between the fuchsia demand curve and the blue supply curve. Well, you have to march a little bit over to the left to get that distance between the demand and the supply curve. So what happens? What happens? We get an even greater market distortion. So the market shrinks by more than 30 units because of this tax. Also, what happens to the relative tax incidence? Well, it looks like the supplier is going to end up paying a little bit more of the tax than the demander does. So the price for the consumer doesn't go up as high as for the less elastic demand curve. So the lesson is that the agent with the more elastic curve in relative terms will pay less of the tax. Okay, so that's it for taxes and price ceilings and floors. So I'd like you to read the section in Mankiw on supply, demand, and government policies. And then on Monday, you'll have another workshop that will allow you to practice these concepts. Have a great weekend, everybody.